Hello children, today we are going to take up a new chapter from Echoes, and the name of the chapter is The Story of an Hour, written by Kate Chopin, who is considered one of the first feminist authors of the 20th century. Chopin was later also acclaimed for her finely crafted short stories, of which she wrote more than 100. Some argue that modern feminism was born on her pages, and one needs to look no further than her 1894 short story, The Story of an Hour, to support the claim. This story was first published in 1894 as The Dream of an Hour before being republished under the current title in 1895. The reader should note the relationship of the leading figure in that story to the circumstances of Kate Chopin's own life. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So here we come to know that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with heart disease, and therefore whatever news was going to be given to her was given very gently and with great care, and the news was about the death of her husband. It was her sister Josephine who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints means as if she was hiding something, that revealed in half concealing. The person who broke the news to her did it very gently. Her husband's friend Richards was there too near her. There were two people with Mrs. Mallard when she got the news of her husband's death. One was her sister Josephine, and the other was her husband's friend Richards. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. Here we come to know about Mrs. Mallard's husband name, who was supposed to be dead, and his name was Brentley Mallard, and it was Richards who actually got the news about the death of Brentley Mallard. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. Here we come to know that Richards got the news about Bradley's death, and he wanted to hurry immediately to Mrs. Mallard's place to break the news himself. He did not want somebody who was less sensitive to break the news of her husband to her, because he knew her problem. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She she wept at once with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arm. When the story of her grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. She did not take the news as many women do, with a shock. She wept at once. She just started weeping, and when she had stopped crying, she just left and went into her room and did not allow anyone to follow her. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body. Haunted means troubled, and seemed to reach into her soul. There was a roomy armchair which was facing the open window. She sat over there. Suddenly she was very tired. The exhaustion that she was experiencing touched her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver. Aquiver means to tremble. With the new spring life, the delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. Eaves means projecting edges of a house. So it was about to rain. There was a peddler and he was selling his goods. So he was crying his wares. She could hear the sound of singing. There were birds also chirping in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was quite exhausted, physically and mentally both, quite emotionless. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression. Bespoke means indicated, and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. Elusive means difficult to understand. But she felt it, creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through her sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. So as she sat there looking out of the window, she was gazing at the sky. She felt some strange thing approaching her. She could just sense it. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. Tumultuously means excitedly. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will. She was trying to fight it off. As powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been, when she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath, free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. Earlier she was a little apprehensive. She was a little frightened. She did not know what was approaching her, but now that terror leaves her. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast. Her eyes were keen and very bright, and she was excited too. And the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. She felt a certain kind of deep joy within herself. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. She's talking about the dead body of her husband here. She knew that she would cry again when she had to see it. The face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and grey and dead, but she was beyond that bitter moment, a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. She now realized that she had gained certain amount of freedom after the death of her husband. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. Here, persistence refers to the fact that men and women continue to force themselves on each other without even realizing, because they consider it to be their right. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. Illumination, understanding. And yet she had loved him sometimes. She had loved her husband, but only sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? Now it did not matter whether she loved him sometimes or she did not love him at all. What could love, the unsolved mystery, could for in face of this possession of self-assertion? Self-assertion means forceful impression, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being. So at this point of her love, she did not matter, her love did not matter at all, because now she has embraced the freedom which she had got after her husband's death. Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louis, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will fall, you will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louis? For heaven's sake, open the door. Josephine was requesting her sister Louis to open the door as she was worried because she might fall ill. Go away. I am not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. So she was actually enjoying the magical moment of freedom. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her. She was imagining herself totally free. Her future days that she would be experiencing of freedom. Her spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. Now that she realized that she was totally free, she was not under anybody, especially her husband. She wished the life to be long. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richards stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latch key. It was Brentley Mallard who entered, a little travel stained. Means he looked a little tired after traveling. So as Josephine and her sister Louise were descending down the stairs and Richards was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, suddenly somebody was opening the door with a latch key, and immediately Richards, when he realized that it was Bradley Mallard, he tried to screen him from the view of Mrs. Mallard. See, composedly carrying his grip sack and umbrella, he had been far from the scene of accident and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife, but Richard was too late in trying to screen Bentley from Louis. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. We come to know that Mrs. Mallard dies, and the doctor said she had died because of the heart disease and of joy which killed her. So, with this, children, we come to the end of the chapter, and the story ends with the doctor's verdict that Louis died of joy.